This man has a very clear opinion of the question whether the AfD is a neo-Nazi party. His name is Niklas Frank. He has spent his life dealing with the legacy of National Socialism and the crimes of the Germans. He is the son of one of the Nazis' highest profile war criminals, Hans Frank. As Hitler's Governor General for occupied Poland, Hans Frank organized the mass murder of millions of Jewish people and other groups. He was condemned to death at Nürnberg and executed in 1946.
Ich verachte ihn sehr, aber ich weiß, dass alles, was er repräsentiert hat, ganz stark am Leben ist. Er hat 2 Stereotypisten gehabt als Generalgouverneur in Polen, im besetzten Polen, die hat er alles mitschreiben lassen, was er öffentlich geredet hat. Da können Sie das Ganze eigentlich umschichten, brauchen nur immer AfD hinzuschreiben. Da ist absolut deckungsgleiche Denke.
Niklas Frank warns that the rise of the AfD is a signal that the inhuman hatred of the National Socialist era is also on the rise again.
Das ist für mich eine tektonische Verschiebung. Die rassistisch-antisemitische Platte legt sich ganz langsam über die liberale und demokratische. Da kommen natürlich wie bei allen tektonischen Verschiebungen Erdbeben. Wie zum Beispiel in Nordhausen hat man jetzt nicht den AfDler gewählt. Das sind ganz kleine demokratische Vulkanchen, die nach und nach absterben werden.
All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about Japan. And what prompted me to do this video is an article that I read recently published by the New Republic. And it talks about how in Japan there is this lack of accountability when it comes to Japanese war crimes. You have Japanese politicians going to the Yasukuni Shrine, where it is believed the souls of the war dead reside, including the souls of Japanese war criminals, and they believe that these souls are kami, or spirits, who live or reside inside the temple. And they believe that the spirits of war criminals reside in this temple, and so they go out and they visit the Yasukuni Shrine, and they pay homage to these spirits. They pay homage to the spirits of the war dead, including the spirits of people who were mass murderers. And so this is the reason why every time a Japanese politician has visited the Yasukuni Shrine, Chinese people and Koreans get pissed off, and rightfully so. Imagine if the Germans built a church and they said that in this church lives the soul of Adolf Hitler, and in this church reside the souls of German war criminals, SS leaders, Joseph Mengele, Goebbels, Göring, Himmler. Imagine that, and imagine all these German chancellors visiting this church. Imagine if Olaf Scholz decided to go to a church like this and say, yeah, I'm here to pay homage to the dead. And it's like, well, who's the dead, right? People who murdered and raped your grandparents. Israel would be absolutely pissed off, and nobody would question Israel in such a case. Nobody would. But when the Chinese get upset, or when the Koreans get upset about Japanese politicians visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, where the Japanese believe the souls of war criminals reside as kami, or as spirits, or divine beings, deities, kami means gods, people will mock at the Chinese. They'll say, oh, why don't these Chinese people stop complaining already? Why don't they just stop bickering? It's the past already, all right? We're here to make money. Let's go buy some Toshibas. And but if Germany did something like this, if German politicians did something like this, if German politicians acted like how a lot of Japanese politicians act, Israel would be pissed off, and America would tell the Germans to stop doing it, and the Germans would probably get sanctioned for something like that. But in Germany, they acknowledge the Holocaust. They have acknowledged the Holocaust since, for decades. I mean, since the beginning of the post-World War II era. And in the East, I noticed, and it's very easy for anyone to notice this, there is a lack of accountability when it comes to horrendous crimes. For example, I remember many years ago when I was living in California, I saw this restaurant. It was called something like Genghis Khan Bar and Grill, I remember. And I remember my father seeing that, and he told me, he said, look at this. There's a restaurant that calls itself Genghis Khan Bar and Grill. I think it was owned by Mongolians. And my dad told me, this is like somebody making a restaurant and calling it Adolf Hitler Cafe or something to the likes of that. I mean, could you imagine that? Genghis Khan the Mongolian Empire was probably worse than the Third Reich. I mean, it murdered so many tens of millions of people. And all of the women that were raped by the Mongolians, it was so horrendous that a huge chunk of the Asian population holds the genes of some Mongolian rapist who traveled around Asia centuries ago. I mean, it was that crazy, absolutely crazy. And why is this? Why is this? Because in the East, there is a lack of accountability. In Eastern cultures, there is this lack of accountability. This is why, for example, you will see Palestinians when they talk about, when they talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they a lot of them, really almost all of them, will refuse to even mention the crimes committed by Palestinians. I mean, this is why anytime you see a debate or an interview with a pro-Palestine activist or a Palestinian journalist or activist, the Palestinian will always say, when he is confronted or when she is confronted about what the Gazan terrorists did on October the 7th, they always say the same thing. Well, let's talk about the occupation. Let's talk about, what Israel has done. Let's talk about what the Jews did. And they don't want to talk about what their own people have done. They don't want to talk about what the Palestinians have done. And that's because in a lot of Eastern cultures, there is a lack of accountability. Whereas in Israel, you will find many Israelis who will talk about the crimes of Israel. They will talk about the wrongdoings that Israel has done. They will talk about crimes such as Sabra and Shatila, how Israel facilitated the massacre of thousands of Palestinians by Lebanese, Maronite, nationalist fascists. You will find many Israelis, in fact, I've said this many times, Israel's biggest demonstration was done as a protest against what the Israeli government did in its facilitation of the Sabra and Shatila massacres, in which you had thousands of Palestinians murdered by Lebanese nationalists. And that was Israel's biggest street protest. Around 1 million or so Israelis took to the streets to protest against Israel for that crime. But where do you see any stories about 1 million Palestinians protesting against Hamas? You don't see that. You see, and this is what is so sickening about Palestinian culture. And this is from someone whose family lives in the West Bank. Much of my family, much of my relatives live in the West Bank. I don't talk to them, and I refuse to talk to them. But I have a lot of my origins in the West Bank. I wasn't born there, but a lot of my familial roots are in the West Bank. And my father was born there. And I have something of an understanding of the culture there, although I don't speak a lick of Arabic, and I have no intention of ever visiting the so-called Holy Land. They call it a Holy Land. There's a whole of a they call it the Holy Land. There's a hell of a lot of unholy things going on there. And I just have, I'm very much so disconnected, beyond some of the cuisine that I still eat. I'm very much so disconnected from Middle Eastern culture. But I have something of an understanding of it. And one thing that I can tell you is that there is a huge absence of something called accountability. There's a huge absence of it. And it's very, very sickening. But this is something that I find to be very ubiquitous and endemic in Eastern cultures, not just Middle Eastern culture, but for example, in Eastern European culture, you see this sort of thing. You'll find Ukrainian nationalists who will deny the crimes of the OUN. They will deny the fact that their Ukrainian nationalist heroes committed horrendous crimes against the Polish people. They will deny, for example, the Volyn massacre, in which you had around 100,000 ethnic Polish people butchered in the most horrendous ways imaginable by Ukrainian nationalists. And the thing is that I don't want people to think that this way of thinking or this mentality is innate in Easterners, or that it has something to do with genetics or the biology of Eastern people or anything like that. It's just a very nasty part of particular cultures. But what worries me is that this way of thinking is springing up in the West. And I've seen this sort of thing, although I've seen I've seen small examples of it, or examples that may not seem to be a big deal. It is growing, and I think it is growing at a rate that is faster than what we would want it to be, or faster than we think. For example, in Germany, and I've said this many times, an ultra-nationalist party has become mainstream. And one of the aspects of this party, called the Alternative for Deutschland Party, the AfD, is that Germans have had enough of talking about the Holocaust, and we shouldn't be focusing so much on the Holocaust, and we should be renewing and reviving German nationalism. And the thing is that when you become indifferent to the past, and this is why it's so dangerous to become indifferent to history, or to become ahistorical, or to deny the past. When you become indifferent to the past, you become indifferent to the repetition of the past. And that's why it's so dangerous. Indifference to the past leads to indifference towards its repetition. Indifference towards the repetition of the past. And indifference towards the Holocaust is growing tremendously in the very country that orchestrated the Holocaust, which is Germany. And if you look at recent studies that have been done, or a recent study that was done, you will see that a huge chunk of the German population has become indifferent to the Holocaust. I want to say, in this one particular study that I looked at, I want to say that I read that around 70% of Germans have become somewhat indifferent towards the emphasis on the Holocaust, or towards even talking about the Holocaust. And I think around 58% of the Germans who were involved in the study, or who took part in the study, said that they wish that the past can be just left behind. In other words, let's stop talking about it. And this is very, very nerve-wracking. And you can see it being reflected in the political reality in Germany. The fact that a party like the AfD is now mainstream, I think, mirrors this growing sentiment. The fact that the AfD's most famous politician, Björn Höcke, stated that this whole policy of talking about the Holocaust in Germany is stupid.
He frequently refers to Germany's Nazi past, and he rejects the official culture of remembrance of the Nazis' mass murders, the Holocaust, and the crimes of the German people.
Diese dämliche Bewältigungspolitik, die lähmt uns heute noch viel mehr als zu Franz Josef Strauß Zeiten. Wir brauchen nichts anderes als eine erinnerungspolitische Wende 180 Grad.
He described it as stupid, and he described it as paralyzing to the German nation, and he stressed that what needs to be done in Germany is a renewal of German nationalism, a renewed German patriotism. And he stated that this patriotism should not only be renewed, it should be enforced. It should be enforced. So this mentality of not wanting to talk about the past, wanting to forget about the past, or be indifferent to the past, or even just downright deny it, this mentality is growing in the West. It's growing in the West. And when you have indifference towards the past, you have an indifference towards its repetition, its repeat. Because what happens is that people will say, stop talking about the Holocaust, who cares? Or stop talking about the Volyn massacre, stop talking about the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists, all of these things. And so when those crimes are repeated, or when you see certain signs that such an ideological movement is coming back, for example, the rise of a party like the AfD, and you say, look, this is something that is similar to what happened in the past, these very people who want us to forget about history, they'll say, oh, why are you talking about that? Oh, yeah, you're just like those SJW cucks. Oh, you're just like those liberals. Who cares? Blah, 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 blah. They're not Nazis. That's a bunch of nonsense, yada, yada, yada. And by making this sort of mocking statements, by speaking in such a cynical or mocking manner, they want to condition people to become indifferent to what is taking place. And it's very, very scary. Very scary. So this mentality in the East, be it in Ukrainian nationalism or Palestinian nationalism or in Japanese nationalism, this way of thinking, don't think that it's only just limited to the East or that it's just something that Easterners do. No, it can come here, and it is here in the Western world, and it's growing. You can see it. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.